Good morning. We're in beautiful Bulgaria with our son and daughter-in-law, and we're having a wonderful time. But we wanted to make this word for the week and to continue giving these messages and the the words that we write, because this is attached to those words. And I'm increasingly aware that some people see the video but haven't got a clue what was written in the text. They complement each other, they're not the same. So read both.
Send us your email if you haven't been added to the list.
I think we undervalue the gospel. We undervalue what we have when we're children of God. And we were sent a video the other day, and we will put the link on the word for the week. It's a video made by Franklin Graham, but it shows how his father, Billy Graham, had interaction with our late Queen. Very interesting. I think he met her 12 times in all.
That's right. There you are.
And it records some of those occasions, and there are images of him with her. And but there's also a lot of footage about the Crusades that took place in the 50s and 60s. And I found myself just weeping as I watched the crowds sitting in Wembley Arena and Haringey, hearing just an uncompromising version, but with great clarity. If you have Jesus, you have the prospect of heaven. If you're without him, you're dead already and you're going to hell. I mean, it sounds so stark when we're so politically correct and sensitive. But actually, people wanted to hear it. They had no hope. There was guilt, there was shame, there was all sorts of things going on. And the press, as usual, accused him of emotionalism and all sorts. And so they chose not to sing the hymn, Just As I Am, without one plea, because they said it was emotional. So in absolute silence, you see thousands of people thronging to the front, just kneeling down, weeping. And the camera pans on a number of faces, and you see the lostness of the people. Jesus looked over Jerusalem and he wept, and he saw them as sheep without a shepherd, as people who were just absolutely lost. And increasingly I found myself looking at people, particularly when they're gathered in the crowd, and you just don't see any peace or joy or happiness, or you see how the people are trying all sorts, casual sex, satisfies for a moment maybe, drink, just drinking themselves to, people waiting for the weekend to get drunk so they can obliterate life. And we as Christians have found peace with God, and we have a wonderful gift to tell other people about. So I was praying about this morning, and I read the chapter in 2 Kings chapter 7, which talks about the siege of Samaria, that in this city, which was surrounded by Syrian hosts and army, people were dying. There was famine. They were eating their own children, and it's just the most awful situation. And 4 lepers are at the city gate. They know they're going to die. And so they decide they'll break through the city gate and go into the army of the Syrians. Hopefully they might be picked up and given some food. But they were going to die anyway, so why not die? Why not take a chance? And when they got there, the Bible tells us that the army had disappeared. They'd actually heard the noise of thundering armies, horses, chariots. And God had caused them to hear that. It was an illusion, and they fled because they thought the Egyptians and the Hittites were going to actually sack them. So the lepers go into this situation, and they find food, they find clothing, they find treasures and everything else. And they then have this word, they say, this is a day of joy, isn't it?
A day of good news. We're keeping it to ourselves.
And we need to go back and tell the people in the city who are starving that the army is gone. And that's what they do. And if you read the scripture, it says, this is a day of good news. We cannot keep it to ourselves. And as I think about this, I think we have good news. We don't really value it as good news, because if you live with peace, you can't imagine what it's like not live with peace, etc. So I want to tell you about two people who found Jesus, and in finding him, or he found them, you know, the wonder of it all was amazing.
Yes, we had a family who came to really, we got to know them as we were living in Sussex in the ministry with Colin Urquhart, and a family Craig went to school and they kind of twinned him up with another boy, and this family came over and they were totally fascinated by the fact that we were believers. We were living in this ministry centre. They thought it was a commune. They thought we were a bit crazy. But when they came over, they discovered that we had something that they didn't have. And I was involved in sharing with the father of this friend of Craig's. And eventually, as the time came on, it's quite a long story, but one evening we sat together and he came to living faith in Jesus, and then he went off and he was a cameraman actually with the BBC, and so he took a film at our summer camp, and you could pick the thing up from there.
So, but carrying this very heavy camera on his shoulder for a week, he actually, had an injury on his shoulder. I went to his doctor, and he just said, have a look at this shoulder, I need some help. And the doctor said to him, how did you do it? And he said, well, I was at this camp, a Christian camp, and I was taking a film. And he said, oh, you're not a Christian, are you? And he said, yes, I am. I've recently become a Christian. So the doctor, who knew him quite well, said to him, so what difference has it made? And he looked the doctor straight in the eye and he said, my guilt has gone. And that was it,
That was it, yes. And he was sharing that in our home group later on, telling the story of his time with the doctor. And another friend, another lady, Hazel, in our group, she said, yes, that's exactly what happened to me. When I found Jesus, I just discovered all the guilt that had been really burdening me all my life had gone.
Mm. See, the Bible says that we will be born again. We can make a clean new start. There's nothing else can give you an opportunity to start again. That's what Nicodemus said. He said, I can't enter into my mother's womb a second time. But actually, Jesus says you can have a complete new start. Sins forgiven, peace given to you, and a friend that walks through the rest of your life with you.
And sharing good news is something that we can do all the time. And it isn't just sort of giving a kind of a kind of witness or a gospel message. It's just sharing the good things that God does in our lives. And there was a man who came many years ago. We bought a house. It had dry rot in it, and we were repairing it. And we had this man who came in professionally to put the chemical in the wall. And he saw our house. He saw our situation, and he just saw the peace that we carried. And he was later date. He was talking to a friend on a train who again was sharing her Christian faith with him, and he said, "It's amazing." He said, she was struggling with cancer. He said, "You've got cancer." He said, "But," he said, "you're full of peace." He said, "You're like those friends of, you're like some friends of, or some people I've been working with down in Truro." And when he told the story, he said, "Oh yes, those are friends of mine." He said, "They've got the same peace that you have." And so there's so much that we can share of the good news as we just interact with people in just the day-to-day life, and it opens a door for the gospel to get in.
But we have to value what we've got in order to give it away. If we believe that we've found the pearl of great price, then we can actually tell others about it. And I tried for years, probably very inadequately, to tell my father about Jesus. And in his very last part of his life when he was in his late 80s. Was it late 80s?
Yes, in his 80s. Yeah,
He came to live with us because he had health issues and he needed to come and live. And he was living in the community pretty fed up, to be truthful, with all this Christian stuff that was going on around him. You know, he couldn't understand why we were so passionate about seeing people and ministering to people and taking crusades and blah, blah, blah. And eventually he said to me, I'd like to go to South Africa and see your sister. What he didn't know, and at that stage I didn't know, was that my sister had become a very committed Christian. So he walked, as it were, from the frying pan into the fire. And she wasn't probably as vocal as I was, but he knew that, you know, what had happened. Anyway, he was in the Kruger Park, and they'd taken him there to visit. And he fell. He didn't break anything, but he fell and shook himself up very, very badly. And he got back. He didn't want to die in South Africa. He knew there was a possibility that this shock could have killed him. So he was in his little rondavel bedroom that he was staying in, and he got down on his knees, pulled a blanket over him, and said, God, get me back to England and I'll sort myself out with you. He'd heard the gospel. He'd heard it many, many, many times. He was living in the midst of people who were totally committed to Jesus. And he heard and felt the presence of God. And he heard God speak and say to him, Stanley, you're a stubborn old man, but I love you. And he just pulled his blanket all around him because he knew he was in the presence of a holy God. So he got my sister. He didn't tell my sister this because he didn't know. I didn't really have words to express it. He didn't know she would understand. He just insisted that he got back to England, and I picked him up at Gatwick, and that's the story he told me. So I said to him, "Okay, Dad. Well, what are you going to do about it?" And he nominated an older man in the community, Francis Pym, and he said, "I'd like to talk to Francis." So he goes up to meet with Francis, and he shaved himself and he had a suit on. It was a very big solemn occasion for him. And he got into Francis' study, and we were trained in the community when people had been prayed with to ask them an open question so that they could actually confess their faith. So, and it was something we just did naturally. So when I was taking my dad to walk him home, I said to him, "So what happened, Dad, then?" And he said, "My sins have been forgiven, and I have peace with God."
Yes.
Now he was well late 80s at that stage, and he'd always objected when we were doing spiritual things. So, but he asked for a New Testament with large print because he couldn't see very well. He read it from cover to cover. He read it like he read his Louis L'Amour books.
Yes, and it was a real sense that he had changed. And just so, just living in the atmosphere of those who just loved Jesus had opened the door, and he found the Lord, he found faith.
Yes, and it became a different man.
Yeah.
And we have that treasure in our earthen vessels, but we have it to give away.
Amen.
And like those lepers, we've got to say, we cannot keep this good news to ourselves.
That's it. So take your opportunities.